Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you, as always, here on this 6th Sunday after Epiphany. It is February 16th. Yes, really, I know what day it is and what day in the lectionary year it is. I swear to you. February 16th, 6th Sunday after Epiphany. Next Sunday is Transfiguration, and then we are into Lent. Can you believe it? The year is flying by. Let's go ahead, though, and turn to our lessons for today. Our first reading comes from Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verses 15 through 20. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him, for that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Again, that is Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 through 20, and there's a lot of death talk, a lot of being led astray talk, a lot of very heavy subjects in there. And it's actually one of two texts that you can choose from this week. The other is from Sirach, which is from the Apocrypha. I know at least one of my friends this week chose the Sirach text as opposed to the Deuteronomy text, because she just felt that the Deuteronomy text was a bit too heavy. She felt like she was going to proof text it too much and, just kind of pick here and there. Because there are a lot of, there's a lot of do this and you'll live, do that and you won't. And of course we know that we often get that image in the Old Testament, but that the New Testament God, through Jesus, through this new covenant, we get that gift of grace. We get that different perspective. We get that new covenant, not just check all these boxes and you will live. Don't check these boxes. Be led astray and you will not live. Very different concepts in the Old and the New Testament. And that Deuteronomy text can be really hard to listen to and really hard to hear. The psalm for today comes to us from Psalm 119. Have you ever looked at 119? I can't remember off the top of my head how many verses it is, but it's a lot. We are only reading 8 verses of that text. So Psalm 19, verses 1 through 8. Happy are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. Happy are those who keep his decrees, who seek him with their whole heart, who also do no wrong, but walk in his ways. You have commanded your precepts to be kept diligently. Oh, that my ways may be steadfast in keeping your statutes. Then I shall not be put to shame, having my eyes fixed on all your commandments. I will praise you with an upright heart when I learn your righteous ordinances. I will observe your statutes. Do not utterly forsake me. Again, that is Psalm 119, verses 1 through 8, and there's some definite similarities, right? You get that concept of walking on a right path. Happy are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. Happy are those who keep God's decrees, who seek God with their whole heart, more walking in his ways. Oh, that my ways may be steadfast in keeping your statutes. So here you get, as opposed to in Deuteronomy, God saying, do this, do that, etc. Now you get the psalmist who is saying, help me to do this. Happy are those who do these things. May I, oh, that my ways may be steadfast in keeping your statutes, that I shall not be put to shame, but, instead having my eyes fixed on all of your commandments. And when that is the case, then the psalmist says, I will praise you with an upright heart. I will observe your statutes. And then we end off, there's this positive spin we're doing. I'm going to do this. I can do it, God. And then do not utterly forsake me. It's such a psalmist thing to do. Isn't that just the way the Psalms go? It's like emotional whiplash sometimes. That's, as you know, why I like the Psalms, though. They cover it all. If you have an emotion, you can find it in the Psalms. Second reading. This is our first New Testament reading, and it comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. And so, brothers and sisters, I could not speak to you as spiritual people, but rather as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for solid food. Even now you are still not ready, for you still are of the flesh. For as long as there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving according to human inclinations? For when one says, I belong to Paul, and another, I belong to Apollos, are you not merely human? What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. The one who plants and the one who waters have a common purpose, and each will receive wages according to the labor of each. For we are God's servants, working together. You are God's field, God's building. And that is 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. And, we're just really dropped down in the middle of this epistle in today's text. Of course, the last 2 Sundays we've read from previous portions of this letter. So, it's not as though we're completely dropped in the middle of it. But, if you're just tuning into this segment, then you're thinking, wow, okay, so, wow. Paul, in his usual Paul tactless sort of way, is like, I can't speak to you as spiritual people because you're not. You're people of the flesh. I have to treat you like infants. That may or may not be as condescending as it sounds. It really depends on how Paul meant it. But he is, of course, addressing issues that are happening in the church in Corinth, and there's a lot of arguing, a lot of quarreling, a lot of jealousy. There are factions developing, I belong to Apollos, I belong to Paul. In one of the earlier texts, Paul wrote, I'm so glad I didn't baptize any of you, and then he goes off on this whole list of people he actually did baptize, which always makes me laugh. But he's saying that these factions shouldn't exist because we belong to God, and that Apollos maybe did something in the church as well as Paul. Paul helped to start a lot of communities and a lot of churches, but that doesn't make Paul greater than God, he is saying. So, Apollos planted and maybe I watered, or the other way around, but God is the one who brings the growth. So God is the one that we all belong to. And, it takes him a bit to get there, but he eventually does come to his point. Paul, he's wordy. What can you say? Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we will be turning our attention to the gospel text for this week. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, and I will be right back.
Hi, this is Alexander Green, Chief Investment Strategist for the Oxford Club. Just for a moment, I'd like you to picture the perfect stock. No doubt it would have hundreds of billions in revenue, more than IBM, Facebook, and Google. It would probably be a leader in cutting-edge technology like smartphones and robotics. It would be on the verge of dozens of blockbuster announcements. But most of all, it would be ultra cheap, trading at less than $3 a share. Now, it may seem crazy that such a stock exists, but it does. It's a cutting-edge tech company that has made deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars with Nokia, Microsoft, and Cisco, and a $29.2 billion deal with Apple. It's set to create 50,000 new jobs right here in America, and Donald Trump even calls it the eighth wonder of the world. Yet you've likely never even heard of the stock. Why? Because it trades under a secret name. To find out how the secret $3 stock can help you retire, simply go to OneStockRetirementNow.com. That's OneStockRetirementNow.com.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast. We are speaking, of course, today about the text assigned for the 6th Sunday after Epiphany, and we've already read the first 3 texts, and now we're turning our attention to the Gospel reading before doing some more in-depth conversation on those texts. The Gospel reading comes to us this week from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 21 through 37. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, "You fool," you'll be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows that you have made to the Lord." But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. And that is Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 37. And you have heard it said, but I say to you. a lot. Jesus says to us a lot. My goodness, this text is, there's a lot in here, and there's a lot that is difficult for many people, especially the parts about divorce. Not an easy text, but we sometimes try to take the text as a whole. Sometimes we take them in part. And it might not look like it at first, but I do think that both the Old Testament reading from Deuteronomy and the Gospel reading from Matthew, both have that idea of a pathway and how God helps to steer us onto that path. You know, we talked a little bit about the pathway from that Deuteronomy reading. There's a quote that I have, and I wrote it down, but I didn't say who said it or where I got it, which is not good. The older I get, the more I need God in my life. I just feel like God keeps me on the right path. Again, I don't know if somebody I know said that to me and I jotted it down. I don't know if I heard it in a lecture, if I read it in a book. Terrible record keeping on my part. I can say that. So the Old Testament reading from Deuteronomy opens with that solemn choice, portrayed starkly in terms of life and death. See, I have set before you today life and death and adversity. This is these terms are so stark that it might seem to be just a single event or a one-time only decision. But placed into a broader context, we begin to see this is more than just that one-time offer or choice, but rather God is referring to a series of events or a series of choices made over the course of a lifetime. Deuteronomy as a whole outlines a covenant relationship between God and the Israelites. They have entered into a binding arrangement with one another, and both parties have obligations to uphold within that arrangement. It's more than just a legal contract, though. The covenant is a reminder of relationship. God brought the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and into the promised land. And we've talked about this before, that whenever God talks about relationship, God always says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, who brought, et cetera, et cetera. So God always puts things into that context. Reminder of, this is our relationship. I am your God. I did this for you, but, it was out of love, and we have entered into this relationship and this covenant together. And of course the Israelites, being human and being flawed, tended to forget that relationship, to forget what God had done for them, and they found it all too easy to just not hold up their end of the arrangement, to just ignore their side of the covenant. So part of what they're being taken to task for in these verses is the worship of idols, both the other gods of the cultures that they encountered and those other less concrete idols that have a tendency to become more important than God. And of course, an idol is anything that we place more importance on than God. It can be money, it can be drugs, sex, etc. Anything that becomes so important in our life that it takes the place of God is an idol. We have to be reminded of the path that the Israelites were on, that the choices that they were making were steering them away from God. They weren't in right relationship with God, and they also weren't in right relationship with each other. And of course, those two things go hand in hand: relationship with God, relationship with each other. So this text is about choices made over the course of a lifetime. How walking in God's ways and observing God's commandments help to keep us on the path that we are called to walk. How these choices affect our relationships with God and with one another. Although it's phrased in a much different way and it's set in a very different context, today's gospel reading is pointing toward the same idea of choices in terms of our relationships and the paths that we take. We are going to take our second break of the podcast. I just realized that was kind of a strange segue, the paths that we take. We are going to take our second break of the podcast. I guess that's a path. At any rate, we are going to take that second break. When we come back, we'll be talking about the connection between the Gospel of Matthew and the text from Deuteronomy. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast. We are switching our attention from Deuteronomy to the Gospel of Matthew. And this is the third of 5 weeks on the Sermon on the Mount, depending on which year of Epiphany, which year we are in. As you know, Easter moves. That means that Ash Wednesday moves. That means that Lent moves. So there can be more or less Sundays in Epiphany. So you can have up to 5 weeks of the Sermon on the Mount. Anyway, this is the third week of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus begins by speaking of those who are blessed as those who are in relationship with God. He then moves on to that image of salt and light. We are named and called to go out and share what we know about our relationship to God with others. And then today's text takes the topic of relationships even further. You know, you have heard it said, but I say to you, it does seem to do so in a rather strange way. It's kind of harsh. It's kind of wordy. Jesus moves from talking about being blessed and sharing that experience with others to the law, and he takes a rather extreme look at the law in this process. So there are two ways that are most often used to interpret the way Jesus talks about the law in the Sermon on the Mount, and both indicate that Jesus is being radical in his speech and actions. In the first, Jesus is being radical by urging us to take the law far more seriously than we've ever imagined. In this view, he's initiating a new law that both exceeds and supersedes the law of his forebears. You have heard it said, but I say to you. This reading takes the ethical demands of the law very seriously, but it renders our lives as faithful Christians as almost entirely a matter of morality. And we know that there's more to it than that, right? My favorite quote from reading for this week wonders about this approach, asking, did Jesus really have to die so that we could have the 10 Commandments on steroids? Yeah. Okay. So we know that Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but did he really come only to make the law so much more intense, simply as a way of being radical? Well, let's look at the second view. That second view goes in the opposite direction. Jesus is radically taking the law to extremes precisely to show us that we are utterly helpless to follow the law. Here we get a decidedly theological twist, not just on this passage, but on the law as a whole. Its main value now lies not as a guide to our lives, but instead as a means to drive us to Christ's mercy. While this version underscores our dependence on God for forgiveness, it also empties the law of any significant moral content. It also pretty much makes Jesus sound like he doesn't actually mean what he is saying. Do we really think that Jesus didn't care at all for the law? Well, no. Again, we have to remember that in last week's reading, Jesus specifically stated that he had not come to abolish the law, but rather to fulfill it. All right, so there's a third way to understand this, and that's more of a middle ground. We need to keep in mind that Jesus has already said in this sermon about being blessed to be in relationship with God, about being called and named to go out and share our experiences with God. This sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, is about the kingdom and how that kingdom is breaking into the current reality. So while Jesus is speaking of and concerned with the law, I think we can better understand what he's talking about if we put his statements into the context of relationships. We might think of the law only in terms of rules and ways of doing the right thing. But the law is really about relationships to God and to each other. That's what the 10 Commandments are. You know, you have the first two that are about God, being in relationship with God, and then that relationship with God moves on to how we can be in relationship with each other because we are in relationship with God. It's easy to forget the relational aspect of the law and get caught up in the rules or that checklist. Am I doing everything right? This is why Jesus intensifies the law, to push us to imagine what it would be like to live in a world where the kingdom is not just breaking in, but is present fully. A world where we honor each other as people who are truly blessed and beloved of God. It's not enough simply not to murder or not to commit adultery, Jesus says. We also have to treat each other with respect, not let our anger get the better of us or act in ways that are potentially harmful to others. If you have studied the catechism, if you're Lutheran, you've studied Luther's small catechism. Luther takes this approach with the 10 Commandments. He says, of course the laws are important. They're the foundation of society, but they're important because they help us to be in relationship with each other, to live in community in some sort of harmony. And then God's law takes it a step further and is given to us as given us to guide in the way God would have us honor, respect, and care for each other. In both Deuteronomy and the Gospel, we are given choices to make. We are given rules to follow. Of course, being given rules and laws can seem like we are being given that checklist. Do these things and you'll be fine. Don't do them and you're in serious trouble. But both texts remind us as well that there is so much more than just a checklist. We are in relationship with God. God who loves us and continually strives to show us that love. The Israelites were taken out of Egypt and into the promised land through that love. We were given God incarnate in the person of Jesus, who came to live among us and show us that love firsthand. If God's kingdom was fully present among us, we wouldn't need rules. We wouldn't need laws and reminders. We wouldn't need to be told and reminded to stay on the correct path. We wouldn't need to be told how to be in relationship with each other. But God's kingdom is not fully present among us yet. And so, of course, we do need some guidelines. We tend to forget that we are in relationship with God. We tend to forget that being in relationship with God also means to be in relationship with each other. And so this takes us back to that story about being on the right path. We all make choices in life, but both law and gospel help us to remember to put God firmly in that path. If we make choices based on looking forward and having God in front of us, we are less likely to veer off that path and wander around aimlessly. We are more likely to treat each other in the ways that we have been called and shown. The season of Epiphany is a time when we proclaim and celebrate God's inbreaking presence in Jesus Christ. We proclaim a living God incarnate and present among us, not some far-off God who we have to placate by checking off rules on a list. This, my friends, is good news. God became incarnate and stepped into the messiness of being human, into the messiness of our lives, seeking to heal and to save. This God offers a life deep and wide, where light shines into every nook and cranny, not a small and flat life reduced to avoiding the big sins. No, Jesus gives us a new way of life. He doesn't reject tradition. He builds on it, of course. This is a way of life that demands more, but also promises more, especially in terms of relationships. It is life abundant, and it is life that is rich with God's love and blessing. Lots of stuff to think about this week. Hopefully you have some food for thought and you can take some of this stuff into your week with you. That is where we're going to wrap it up for today. Thank you as always for joining me. If you are a fan of this podcast and you have not yet subscribed, you should do so that you can get podcasts as soon as they come out. And if you are a fan of this podcast and would like to leave us either a written or a 5-star review, that would be fabulous. Also follow us on social media. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Would love to hear from you, hear your thoughts, hear what's going on in your life. And I hope I hope you had a wonderful weekend, and I hope the week ahead is looking promising. Please, as you go through that week, do remember that you are a beautiful and beloved child of God. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.